Hi everyone, welcome to my monthly webinar, which kind of missed February, but who knows, we'll get the best of March as well. This time I'm going to talk about test planning for APIs. This is something that I come up a lot with. People have their APIs, and we're not going to talk about the development side today, we're going to talk about the testing side today. And this is sort of going to be a two-parter because the next webinar is going to be about test design for APIs. I'm going to mention that as well. Basically, well, you'll see, actually. I'm guessing you know APIs, and I'm guessing that I'm going to show my example in Postman. So some familiarity with Postman is okay. If not, that's cool as well. Most of what I'm going to talk about is basically the concept behind that. And let's start. My name is Gil. I'm your host today. As with most of my webinars, actually. I'm a consultant and trainer, and I help developers, testers, product people, whoever wants to become better at software. The author of the books, the ones you see on the top and the left. You can get in touch with me at the email you see on the screen, gil@testinggil.com, and testinggil.com, which gets you to everydayunitesting.com, name of the book, name of the site. I'm on Twitter because Elon still lets me spend my time there. And the final slide is going to be where else you can find me. I'm going to start with an example. So this is like creating an API. It's a post API. You can look at it, the example. You probably can guess what it does. Okay, so and you probably will be right. It adds a user with these kind of details. And the question would be like, how do you know that it works? Well, it returns a 201 code, like created. Does that mean that it works? Probably not. I will need other things to corroborate it. So for example, I will probably need to look at the database to look at the tables that a user was actually added. Maybe I will have a get API that will help me look at the user I created. So there's kind of a behavior that's expected or documented. I was given a spec, and I can check it. And basically, well, I can look at the results. The question is, have I tested it enough? Is it okay? Is it working? So we already kind of gathered that, well, maybe it returns 201. Can't really trust that. We can, but not enough. If I can get the user, fine. If I delete the user because I added it, fine. Maybe it appears with if I get all user, all the user lists, it will be there. So that's another way to corroborate that add users work. So defining what an API, how that the API actually does what it needs to, you can see it becoming more complex. Here's another example. I know you probably shouldn't do this, and I don't usually, but this is just to make a point. So a login API takes 2 query parameters, username and a password. And how do I know that it works? Well, if it works, it works. What happens if it doesn't? So let me give you another hint because it's hidden in the specs that I wrote myself. It says that if you're trying to log in 3 times and you fail, then you're locked out of all the APIs. The behavior of all the API change because you logged in incorrectly. And to make matter worse, it's on a timer. You can wait an hour and then the behavior changes again. So behavior of an API impacts not just the API, it impacts other APIs as well. So if you're thinking, well, am I testing this API No, you're actually testing a lot of things here. So if we continue to think about APIs like small little Lego blocks, it's not really going to work. It's actually more like the thing in the bottom here. Everything's connected to each other and impacts each other. So when we're thinking about what we're going to do, we need to think about, well, what is the expected behavior, where we will see it, and what would we need to do in order to see that. Like I mentioned, there are two parts to this. What we're going to talk about, in my view, test planning, is what are the coming up with cases that we'd like to check or test. And check meaning we'd like to corroborate our expectations or the spec or whatever. Test to see what actually happens when you actually trying to press two buttons with not large enough hand. So that's the test planning part. Basically, what the output of test plan is basically a list of cases, and maybe combined with a prioritization thing. So you prioritize test cases that you want to check or test and perform the tests by yourself. Throw away things that you have much confidence in and you won't have time for. Some of them you decide you're going to automate, some of them you're going to do manually or sporadically. That's the test planning part. The test design part is how you're actually going to do that. And there are different ways to do that. One way is to come to the next webinar, because I'm going to talk about this next time. I'm not going to talk about test design today. So basically, yeah, we're coming up with APIs and we will look at them and we kind of have like, we're going to create a test plan, coming up with it. It's a bit too complex, and we need to come up with a plan of how to build a plan because it is complex. So how do we do that? There are many ways to do it, like get a lot of people in the room, start throwing stuff on the wall, notes, post-its and stuff like that, which works. The more people who knows what they're doing probably will come up with a good plan. The less people, it's going to be a smaller list. I'm going to tell you about something that some of you may have bumped into in testing, which is called, no, not this thing. SFDIPOT, yeah. It's not a magic word. It's a way to come up with a plan. So basically, it's a testing heuristic, and I'm going to use the definition of heuristic by James Back, who was one of the people who created SFDIPOT. SFDIPOT is an acronym. I'm going to introduce it in the next slide, but I'm going to start first with the definition of heuristic, which is a valuable method of solving a problem. Basically, when we're talking about good best practices, kind of think of what is a best practice. This is what we want to learn, right? This works every time, everywhere, for everyone. Usually, our life is more complex than that, and usually it doesn't work for every situation there is. Like very small set of things work for everything. What we're actually looking for is some things that work for most of the people most of the time, and maybe they will work for us. And this is a heuristic. So a test heuristic or test planning heuristic that SFDIPOT is a way to cut down the problem, looking at the different perspectives, and it works most of the time, and it will work for APIs as well. It works for me. I hope it will work for you. And I'm going to show you different examples of how you can take this heuristic and translate it into a full example, and hopefully you can take it to your examples and code and production, stuff like that. So what is SFDIPOT? It's an acronym. The structure, functionality, data, interface, platform, operation, time, which I said in almost as quickly as I can say supercalifragilistic. Basically, it's a way of looking at the problem, like I said, and trying to think, well, if it's like that or differently, what can I do about it? And structure means of how the application is built. Functionality, usually what we're thinking about planning, what it actually does. Data, what kind of data it handles. Interfaces could be all kinds. I'll show you a couple of examples. Platform, what it runs on. Does it make a change? Operation. We'll talk about my interpretation for our operation applies to APIs, but you can have another interpretation. And time, we usually, if it's dependent on time, expiration, stuff like that. We'll talk about different examples of how things can change behavior based on time. It also covers concurrency, things happening at the same time, frequency, stuff like that. Now, here's a warning to you. I'm going to give you an interpretation that works for me, like I said, and you'll see that some things fit into different buckets, and that's okay, because this is a way to come up with cases. It doesn't really matter which bucket it goes into. If you already come up with a case, it's good. It doesn't really matter where you go from here, which bucket and where you put it, because nobody grades you on where you put it, or you need to fill which bucket. It's a way to start thinking about things. And what I'll try to do in this session is apply it to APIs, because usually SFDIPOT is a way to look at features and actually try to do that. If you're talking about APIs, maybe things change a bit, because like I said with the post, how do I know that it's work? If it works, where do I see the effect? So try to apply it with caution. I'm going to do that. Before we dive in, I want to remind you, I'm giving workshops about these things, on these kind of topics, API automation. I talk about this. You can check out the site or ping me about information for this, and then maybe I can help you. So what would be our examples? My example would be a scheduling meeting API. 3 of them, because it's more of a feature really. So I have a post API / schedule, and you see the body, an example of the body that I'm sending. It has a topic, date, start time, and length. Yeah, and it's basically, it's not really complex. I have 2 more APIs. I get with a topic as a query parameters, and I just put here the meeting that can have spaces in it, because yeah, it can break stuff, but doesn't matter for our example. Although talking about what kind of data can we send, well, something with spaces is interesting. So I have both a get and a delete with the topic as a query parameter. This is all my sandbox. This is what I'm going to play with, and I'm going to see how this applies. How I can take the SFDIPOT visors and look at this. So demo. I'm going to go into show and into Postman land. Okay, so if you're familiar with Postman, great. If you're not, it's a tool for execution, defining, and running tests of APIs. It's a tool. It's not the tool, but it's quite, you'll find it in the wild in many cases. And what I said, you can define APIs. I defined the APIs here. So basically, you can define an open API using YAML, and you can see that this basically what I showed you. I have here. So in my paths, I have on the root, I get the get, and I've already defined that I can get a 200 if the item is there, 404 if it's not. All the examples I'm going to show you is within Postman, including the saved ones. You don't need to define everything. Talk about that as well, but it helps if you do that. Delete can return 200 if it actually deleted something. For if you're trying to delete something that's not there. What else? The post with a schedule has the request body that I showed you as an example, and usually returns 201. It also returns something I defined as a 400, like a bad request or something like that. If you're trying to schedule something that is already scheduled with the same topic. That's all we know. This is the spec. Okay. And then let's test. So here are the examples that I thought of as I was building this. And obviously, they're not the only ones, but I'm going to share with you my way of thinking. And I'm going to go describe things about what parts they are. So structure. So how is this thing built? This is very interesting. So how does an API, how is an API built? Well, we're talking about monoliths, we're talking about microservices. They can be very small. Maybe chains within a chains of services. Sometimes when we're starting off from a black box, we don't know that. Now, this is a very poor starting point. We'll talk about that in the next webinar in test design. But if we know something, at least a bit, about how how things are working within it, maybe we can try to do something about it and test it. So for example, here's my schedule. So I'm posting the schedule with this body here. And basically, if it works, I'm going to check that it contains a 201 and the response contains the correct values. Postman allows me to do that during tests. So this is my expectation of like what the spec that I told you. If I know, however, that the logic and the database are sitting on separate machines, which happens a lot in microservices, I can ask questions. Well, what happens if there's a disconnect between the logic and the database? Or what happens if there's a disconnect between the client, in my case, the Postman, and the logic itself? Because a logic, we're talking about a web server, maybe the web server, the gateway is available, but the logic is not. So there could be different kinds of things that I might be expecting and want to check. Thank you, Michael Bolton, for the description on SFDIPOT. Go read that after this. So what can I check? Well, maybe there's a client error. So client error means that something happened before it actually went to the server. The server returns it. It could be like a timeout, like a 4.0x something. The 4x class of errors is called client errors. And it's something that the client sees before it actually got to the server code. It could also be a server error, like a 503. Two scenarios. So first one is the client error. Well, you know, we get a timeout because the server tried to go into the database, but I disconnected the database, and it waits for a long time, and somehow at some point the web server said, well, you've waited a while, not going to wait anymore, going to return a timeout. That's one thing. The server error, though, can be something else. Like it got to the server and it called the database, and the database somehow times out, latency. We don't know what happens there. And the server decided, well, this is an error. I need to crash. This is what you get, like a service unavailable. You can't call me from now on. So these kind of behaviors is something that I sometimes expect if they are in the spec. Sometimes I want to try and find out how they are working. And all this is based of me knowing how the application is built. If I know how to do this, maybe, and the application is giving me the option to configure things, I can create situations or design a situation where the database doesn't work or the server doesn't talk with me. So having knowledge about the structures allows me to come up with different cases that I'd like to check. So this is structure, and we can play a lot with this. Functionality is basically what we're thinking about. Well, what are we going to test? Usually think about functionality. And when we translate it to APIs, remember the small bricks of Lego, usually think of well, how this API almost in solitary in isolation works. And I can check like if I do the post like before, it will succeed, return 201. So this is how the API behaves. In my case, turns 201, returns like a copy of the fields that I sent in the body. I want to make sure that they are there. What happens if I try to schedule the same thing? Well, not the same thing, trying to schedule something with the same topic. This is the same topic I used before, although I'm using different details here. Like I tell you from the spec, well, it's supposed to return an error. So I'm going to return a 400. And I actually will look at the example I prepared. And this is also in the YAML. A response can contain a JSON message as well. I might want to check that as well. So this will be like, where's my test? So my test will check that it's a 400 and the right message is there. Is that enough? We'll see that it's not enough. But this is basically scenarios of how the API works. And you can say, well, this existing thing trying to schedule it upon an existing topic is it's an edge case, maybe. It's not, it's spec'd out. It's supposed to work like that. Same way goes for the get and for the delete. We can look at the different APIs and see how they work. Basically, I've already connected the get to the post, so because I'm querying something that I actually scheduled before. So there's already some kind of connection, which going to be a lot more complex when talking about operation, how APIs chain each other and call each other. So on functionality, we can do all kinds of things. I kind of broke down the feature to the different APIs, and some of them like maybe positive, happy paths, something that don't care about that. For me, it's about spec things and how they should work. Postman, by its natural behavior, allows me to run everything under a folder or a collection, step by step, which kind of create a sequence of things that kind of help me think about what do I do first. It does tie the behavior of these things together. But it's a way to think about things. And you can see that just spending this time in this kind of structure inside this kind of lets me think about things. It's a good thing. I can use mind map and use this. So this is functionality. Basically, when we think about functionality, this is what we do. But it's complemented with another thing, the data. So what is the data? With APIs, it's a bit more complex because I showed you the schedule. Yeah, schedule one has this body, kind of defines it. And basically, when everything's working, so everything's working. But we need to remember that basically we're talking about API requests. API requests send strings or streams of binary data. Within this string, we can create all kinds of strings, not just like this. So for example, we know that the API requires 4 fields, but what happens if I send only 3? Can do that. How will the API behave? In my case, it's I defined it to be like a 400, an error. But I want to see what happens. The same thing could be like with additional fields, right? I can do whatever I want here. I can remove a comma and set invalid JSON. I can do that because the server needs to handle that. In some way, I need to know how it handles that. I'm having the ability to send whatever string I want. Another thing with data, what happens, you see, I'm sending the length as an integer. I can send whatever integer I want, right? It's actually a number. What happens if I send a negative number? I want to see how the server handles that. Does it handle floats or doubles? I don't know. So I'd like to find out. And you see that things are getting a bit more complex here because I just showed you an example of what the API expects. It can expect whatever it wants. I can send everything, whatever looks like a string. Here's another thing. What happens if I send the topic with Arabic letters? HTML did a new meeting, but I'm not sure if the server will understand. Does it work with that? Does it work with encoding of 16-bit rather than 8-bit? I don't know. Does it work? I can define it, and maybe it's written in the spec that it can, but I want to check if it works or not. Another thing I can do is, so far I told you I'm sending JSON and getting JSON. What happens if I'm sending XML or plain text? How will the server work? How will the server behave? What's going to, is it expected to receive, maybe it will return a JSON. Maybe it will return an XML. I don't know. Maybe it doesn't support XML. It will not understand what I'm sending. What happens if instead of that, I'm sending a JSON, but I'm requesting through the headers, and you can see that in the header, the accept, I'm expecting not the regular give me everything you can, but I'm asking for a specific format, this time XML. How will the server behave? Now, this is a very simple one API, okay? You can do this with all these APIs that you can think of. But look at the number of fields, the structure of the string, playing with the headers. All these can play with different types of settings of data and what can impact the server. And I'd like to find them, how it works. Obviously, there's a lot more. You can play with the parameters and path parameters, and whatever the server tells you, you can do a lot more. You can, in the case of our body here, yeah, I sent here like 15 characters. What if I send the entire crime and punishment novel? Okay, it could be like, how does the server handle that? It's still for JSON. It's still like a giant thing. Just using whole chapters in Russian to name a topic. How will that work? I want to find out. I didn't mention that. Maybe I didn't halfway, but it's a good way to put it. Do I have? I'm just coming up with ideas. Do I need to actually perform them? I can decide. This is the prioritization thing. The more I know what's working, what's not working, if it's new, if it's not new, I'd like to know more. I can actually look at what I know about the application, the developers, its lifetime, to check. And this could change over time because I can have a very big bunch of test cases, and I may decide I'm not going to bother with the XML stuff until things are kind of slow down and things are robust. But maybe it will come online. Maybe the big data thing doesn't make sense to do at this point because it will probably fail. Could be as well. So I can decide what to check, what to run, what to automate. And these decisions can change over time. So this is playing with data, and you can play a lot with data. Interface. Now, usually when we're talking about SFDIPOT interfaces, we're talking about interfaces to the system, to the feature. but APIs, the I itself is an interface, right? So usually there's not much here, although when talking about interfaces, generally, we're talking about interface, who's talking to our system, and our system talks to somebody else's. What happens on these kind of interfaces? Maybe even the disconnect with the database could be falling into this bucket of interfaces. But I decided to show you something else. So if you look at the headers that I'm sending, usually you'll have a field called user agent. Postman gives it by default, the Postman runtime and the version. And I can change that. And I can impersonate curl. Curl is a tool that you have both on Windows and Linux. Like, it's a tool for issuing HTTP request from the command line, a CLI tool. So what happens if I'm sending header fields to the system? So the server basically could be like a black box for me, or I know how it actually works. And usually what happens is that there's also some sort of gateway that looks at the header and kind of filters things that it likes into that. And after that, there might be some kind of code, what we call the server logic, that may look at this kind of headers. And we might want to see if things behave differently for different interfaces. We know that sometimes web interfaces, mobile interfaces, may not work the same. Kind of think of APIs, well, they're just logic. Sometimes they return HTML, sometimes they return images. And for curl, images is not something that it'd like. So when we're talking about like how does my server react in this API thing, I can send a request with curl and it may tell me, well, everything's okay or not. Another thing that I put into the interface bucket is authorization. What happens? It doesn't have to go into this bucket. This is how I thought about it. If I send this very secure thing in basic authentication, not a token, a server can reply unauthorized because it works only with tokens, and as it should be. So it's an interface. This is how I talk to my API, usually with headers, with tokens, stuff outside the functionality. But on top of it, and it's part of the API call, I'd like to know how these things actually behave. What happens if it's HTTP? What happens if it's HTTPS? Things that I want to know. So things around that. What else? It's not just like these things. If your APIs have versions, what happens if somebody called my API on version 2, but thought it was talking to version 1? But he's not expecting the result. What happens then? Other than that, like different front ends might impact the result. Do I know this? Maybe I do. I talk to the developer, inspect. I have some examples. That's good. Maybe not. Maybe it's important for me to find out. Platform. Platform is basically what the system is running on. Does it matter to me? Well, sometimes it does. It really happens. If I have some more information about the system, it will get me more curious about what's going to happen inside it. I give you an example of what it works on Linux but not works on Windows. Why would it? Well, if the logic behind the scenes talks outside its own memory to its file system or the registry or whatever things you may come up with, it really depends on where it's running. Even more so, it depends on some kind of dependencies. For example, if the server is running on a JDK 11, And I might want to know if I'm calling 11 or if I'm calling 17, if it's installed correctly, what is the behavior? So I want to know what's happening there. Another thing about platform is that, and it kind of connects to the structure, maybe a bit to time. What happens if there's some latency? How does the system behave? We talked about disconnection. What happens if over time kind of latency? Something that happens on a distributed scenario rather than on everything on the same platform. So structure and platform and how transients kind of connect together. You can think about different things that you'd like to learn about the system and how the API behaves. Final thing, API is running on on board. Sometimes we have on embedded memories, embedded boards, we have limits on memories, limits on disk space. This might have an effect on what happens if the database actually gets full. It can get full when you don't have a lot of disk space. So you might want to see what is the behavior of how this API reacts when these things happen. Again, you need to design these things to see how things happen. You can fill up the disk with all kinds of logs in order to see what actually happens. But these are questions that we come up with and see. There's a lot of things going over in the chat, which I'll go to in the end because I can't really do two things at the same time, much like Postman. So if you have questions, put them there, either in the chat box or the Q&A. Hopefully the Q&A is better. I will go over them at the end. So platform. Everything connected of how things are running. Operation. So operation can, well, how is it connected to functionality? So I already gave you a hint about connecting the APIs together, which I'll show you a couple of examples. And this is where things become really complex exponentially, because you can connect everything together and create different kinds of combinations, but it can get even more complex than that. So here's one scenario, and this is where you think about running APIs one by one. So if this is like trying to schedule an existing topic. I already told you, not possible, right? So if I'm running this, the post will, first one will succeed, get will succeed, getting the same thing. Trying to schedule with the same topic will fail, expecting it to fail, bad request. But what happens when I do the get? I'm expected to get the data of the first one. So the test will check for, will get this thing, and I have to create my tests in order to remember the one before the schedule. So this is what you see here. I'm saving the old date from the first one, and I'm comparing it. I'm missing a line here. I need to compare it to the one that I'm getting right now. So this is one scenario. Here's another one. I'm trying to schedule a deleted meeting. Is it possible? So I'm scheduling a meeting, making sure I get it, making sure I delete it, which is successful. And then I'm trying to get the deleted one to see if it fails. This one should fail because it's not found. Get 404. But after that, I'm doing the schedule with the same topic. Is it possible? Well, obviously it's possible. Obviously, not sure. I want to check if it's working. So can I do that? This will succeed, and then the get should get the new data rather than the old data of the same topic. One scenario, two scenarios. Here's another one. What happens if I delete twice? I want to make sure that if I schedule a meeting, which succeeds, I delete it, which succeeds, tends to 100, but then I delete the same meeting again because I can send the same parameters. I want to make sure that it gets a 404. It's a very simple scenario. I want to see if it's working. What happens if I try to get a meeting with a schedule that failed? So here I'm sending the schedule with only the three fields, which should fail. Okay, I want to make sure that get doesn't find it. Okay, where do you see it? Here. Get it and delete as well. So I can play with all kinds of combinations of these things. If I had a get all meetings, I probably would check that it's not there as well. So all these things like a combination of things, but it's not the only way to think about it. Like if I create the meeting and you try to delete it, is it possible? Same API, right? Different operations. Okay, so I need to think about my tests and try to see if they're happening, and do they lead to at least the result I expect. Okay, almost out of time. So, like I said, time is basically the bucket of where we put things that are either related to time or dependent on time or happens concurrently. We'd like to see, well, if I call this like with 500 clients at the same time, are requests being handled in order? Does the system crash? Does the system get slow? I want to learn about the behavior of this. So all kinds of questions. I'm going to show one example though, with the data though. So what happens, where's my body? I'm trying to schedule something in the past. Now, meetings are very dependent on time. Not sure if you know. So you can say, well, this is data, right? Well, it is data related, but it's still time related. So what happens? Is it something that will work or not work? I expected that it will not work. But you can think about like overlapping meeting. Will it work? Can I schedule something that doesn't start at the same time, but start after, but before the length of the meeting? Interesting. Special times, not related to this application, but February 29th, which we just missed again. Daylight saving time. What happens if when the clock goes backwards? Can we schedule the same thing on the same time? Interesting. If we scheduled, is it still there? Things that also date related, like sales on Black Friday. Okay, think about it. The discounts that are related to this specific day. Things will be different. Do I see this kind of behavior? Concurrency, I mentioned how those things handle or not handle, not just the load, but in terms of behavior. I'm expecting this behavior that I expect, like things being in order, not in order, chaos, whatever. I'd like to learn what happens if there are increasing delays over time, timeouts. And I think that you can think about that. Is time related, can go into this bucket, and you can design systems to help you answer these kind of questions called APIs. And this can work for any API, because maybe get will be problematic rather than the post. So these are examples of SFDIPOT. This is a way to cut down our features, our applications into small parts, different kind of visors, different kind of glasses. Look at the system and come up with all kinds of cases. And once you do that, once you got all kinds of cases, you can like organize them maybe differently or not, if it makes sense to you. Come up with more cases maybe. And basically go back to our slide, do this. So we build an API, create a test plan, prioritize it, test it, and then think of more cases. And this is, like I said, this is also time related. Over time, you decide to emphasize more things de-emphasize other things, come up with more cases and try to find them, decide on what to automate or not, and maybe think of more cases. And this is what I wanted to share with you today. Just want to remind you that there are courses for that. If you already forgot, ping me, I'll remind you. If you have more questions, put them in the Q&A box. I'll go over the chat things to see what I missed, because there are probably a lot of things happening here that well, this is not people asking about the recording. There's going to be a recording. Thank you, Michael Bolton, for being here, and also for the link for SFDIPOT, how to validate empty values for integers and strings. Well, it goes back to what do you want to learn, and it's like, is the server working with that? Find a way to find a string that actually works. If Postman doesn't let you because it may be problematic to send, we probably won't. Find another tool. But it's basically strings. You can send whatever you want, whatever encoding, whatever white space you're doing, and find out how your server is working. Is it good practice to automate all the negative cases? I don't know. How important are they to you? Negative cases, again, I'm going back to my definition. I don't like the positive negative thing. If things are spec'd and important, then I will probably want them automated to make sure that I don't break them. If they're not important because it can suffer an error and continue working, maybe it's not that important. The prioritization comes from risk analysis. Kind of define what is important for us and what is not. So once we understand what is important, and with an asterisk, it can change over time, we can actually decide what to do, whether to automate or not. Maybe remove it from the suite when we're done with it, because it doesn't give us more information as we move forward. Recordings, yeah, negative, not negative. And yeah, so on to the questions. When's the next webinar? Not sure yet. It's going to be in April, but follow up on social media and newsletter and stuff like that, and you'll know. Aren't many tests just duplicating what should have been covered on unit test level? Plus, maybe. Although a lot of APIs today, it really depends on logic and how the code is written. If you know about these things, the answer might be, well, yes, the code is complex. It should have been unit tested. It's not, or it is. If you don't know how it's written, how do you know if it's covered or not covered? So we need more information also to make a prioritization well. Because with this kind of information, if it was unit tested, well, maybe I can skip on some things. Specifically, if you're coming out from a point of view that you don't trust anything that the developers do, usually don't recommend this point of view. Don't trust them, test everything. I usually don't recommend this point of view. I recommend working together, understanding where you need to put your effort in, because you don't have a lot of time. Important scenarios, yes, again, what's important to you? How may we sync the Postman with idea to improve the for creating autotest? Ooh, so that's a whole Postman thing. Postman works as a service, therefore you can't sync the code with it, which is kind of a problem. It tries to give you all kinds of workaround, basically, but you giving it everything, but it doesn't work. You can connect it to a source control in the cloud. If you have your source control on-prem, probably won't work. And that's a problem, because you want to version set of your tests with the version of your code. That's the main thing why I find Postman lacking in that kind of scenario. There are ways to do this. You can export the collections and put them in source control, and then you can run them. It's not my kind of solution. How to test JSON, which is changing frequently due to business technical requirements. That's good. Interesting. Well, tests are examples. You can't really test the JSON that changes. You have to think about what kind of changes you want to set up as an example and then call the APIs with it. Everything within automation or any test that you check basically is you have to come up with everything in order to have this kind of scenario. If it changes, like, let's take an example about my example. Whenever you do a schedule, what's returned, it also contains an ID, which is generated in the application. So you can use that ID for other things. Basically, it's dynamic. You can't really find it, but you can program around it, like save it and use it for other APIs as well. So you need to understand what's dynamic here and what you can save and you reuse, what isn't. Basically, tests and automated tests are examples. You're selecting your input and go with it. If it changes, it depends on what you want to cover. If your examples are good enough, that's okay. If they're not, try to use more examples. It's not really a good solution for that. You need more details to find out what is good for you. Do QA engineers work as unit testers? Usually they don't. I'm not sure if I'm not going to be judgmental about this. Usually unit tests are written by the developers who write the code. There's some skills involved, some knowledge about the code, and you can think about it in a way that if I write the code, obviously I know it works, so obviously I know how to test it. We're not thinking about this same way, right? So do I recommend testers and developers working together? Do I recommend testers help build the unit test plan? Yes. Do I recommend testers review the unit tests that the developers have written? Yes, of course. Read the code as well. The more you know, you can understand where it works and put your effort somewhere else, and the vulnerabilities and what you want to learn from that. Is JS good for API testing? Well, it's good for building servers. There's nothing good or bad about languages or tools. It's how we use them. And you can do a lot of things with JavaScript, and including automation, and it may work for you and it may not work for you. Try. Cannot tell you like this. And this was not my recommendation for Postman, by the way. I like Postman of what he does. I don't like what he doesn't do, like the whole integration with CI tools. And I'm very forward about this. What I really like about Postman is it visualizes a lot of things that like I can show you a lot of the things on the screen and you'll understand it. Okay. Should have been unit tested sounds like a moral judgment. We don't judge here. So final opportunity for you to ask me a question. If not, I will say goodbye to you. So like I said, next time is going to be about what complements this thing, thinking about test design and what goes into that, and how can we build a system that runs our test to tell us what we want to learn. This is the way you can get in touch with me. Recording will be up soon. You'll be notified when we are ready to tell you that it's ready, and hope to see you in the next webinars as well. Thank you and goodbye.
Hey everyone, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, share and subscribe for more. Thanks for the support, and remember, live long and test.